Sunday off to be with us. Um, we're going to be discussing this afternoon about forest landscape restoration and how to enhance and increase ambition through forest landscape restoration in nationally determined contributions as a way to achieve the Paris Agreement. As a way to achieve the Paris Agreement and to get to a 1.5-degree world. We know that the Paris Agreement has acknowledged the role not only of the role of forests and other ecosystems and the land sector as a whole as instrumental for achieving the objectives of mitigation and adaptation of the Paris Agreement, but also the Paris Agreement recognizes the importance of enhancing carbon stocks, forest carbon stocks, through restoration and through sustainable practices. This has also been broadly acknowledged by the most recent IPCC report, which calls countries and different stakeholders, private sectors of national governments, the civil society in general, to come together and work on the governance challenges that are still out there to implement those nature-based solutions that could help us maximize the mitigation benefits from the land sector while ensuring that there are synergies between mitigation and adaptation. So this is a little bit about what we are going to be discussing today. The restoration movement has been gaining traction in the past 10 years, and the Bonn Challenge is proof of this. To date, we have about 56 countries that have pledged over 168 million hectares to be restored under the Bonn Challenge pledge. However, this is not captured fully in the NDCs. While 77% of NDCs recognize forest and other land-based mitigation efforts, only 26% of NDCs contain quantifiable and actionable targets. So how do we move from commitment to action? How do we align our international commitments under the CBD, under the Convention for the certification, under the UNFCCC in a way that help us to use the resources that are out there, both from international cooperation and domestic funding, to green that funding and make sure that we have cost-efficient interventions in the land sector. So to discuss this, we have a very interesting panel today, so thank you all to be here. We have Ruth Irlen. Ruth is the Policy Officer for Conservation and Sustainable Forest Management for the Minister of Environment, Nature Conservation and Nuclear Safety from Germany. She's going to open this event with some opening remarks, and we have our three panelists who I'm going to introduce after Ruth's opening remarks. Ruth?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Maria. After a wonderful lunch break, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to bring you back to the topic of forest landscape restoration. And the Bonn Challenge on forest landscape restoration has gained huge momentum since it was established in 2011. This ambition was taken forward in 2014 by the New York Declaration on Forest with another 200 million hectares of forest. So that's a goal to restore in total 350 million hectares of forest by 2030. Since then, very dynamic regional Bonn Challenge processes and conferences took place in which political leaders and governments announced their national goals, laying the foundation for forest landscape restoration at scale. This is an amazing process. Roughly 1/3 of those national goals on forest landscape restoration have also been reflected by the nationally determined contributions to the Climate Convention. The restoration of forests and other ecosystems play a pivotal role to reach a balance between emissions and removals. The recent IPCC report on 1.5 degrees Celsius left no doubt we have only a fair chance of limiting global temperature rise to a maximum of 1 degrees Celsius if we remove carbon from the atmosphere. I would like to cite a recent study from Fern and Rainforest Alliance Norway, Return of the Trees, who assessed that the Bonn Challenge could remove 50 billion tons of carbon from the atmosphere. So forest landscape restoration is part of the solution. And it is important to accelerate action and prioritize those actions which are attributable for climate, biodiversity, and sustainable development. Forests are key to enhance the benefits from biodiversity and ecosystem services as set out by the Aichi biodiversity targets. By regaining the ecological functionality on the of the landscape and enhancing human well-being, forests are also highly relevant for the achievement of the Agenda 2030 and its related sustainability development goals. In particular, supporting sustainable livelihoods and societies by implementing SDG 15 on life on land. We should also keep in mind the report of the Global Partnership for Forest Landscape Restoration in 2011, which identified that 1/4 of the potential for forest landscape restoration can be realized through wide-scale restoration of closed forests and 3/4 through mosaic restoration. Integrating forests and trees in landscapes, also including agroforestry and silviculture, pastoral culture. These restoration activities enhance the conservation, recovery, and sustainable management of ecosystems and also facilitate landscape connectivity. They improve the ecosystem services and enhance the resilience of the landscape in the long term. This is visible and understandable by the people living in those landscapes. To me, it's quite clear that by including and engaging people in a participatory way and addressing their needs, those ambitious goals can only be realized. Personally, I was very inspired of the speech of Tony Rinaldo, who won the Right Livelihood Award for restoring forests in Niger and other countries, which he gave last week at the GLF in Bonn. To him, the changing behavior and attitude in the way we manage landscapes is key. So I would say success depends on including the people and also on the political will to restore a country's forests. On a clear assignment of roles and responsibilities, and targeted support to scale up successful approaches and business cases. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ruth. And now I want to introduce our panel so that we can discuss a little bit about their experience and what they have been seeing in the practice and how this engagement of the stakeholders of different sectors in changing that behavior and how we use the land and how we manage the land has been feasible, and what are still the remaining barriers or the challenges that you see. For this discussion, we have today Jorge Ernesto Quesada. He's the Ministerial Advisor for the Ministry of Environment and Natural Resources from El Salvador. We have Stephanie Avalos. She's the Undersecretary for Climate Change from the Ministry of Environment and Water from Ecuador. And we have Alan Kroger. Sorry if I pronounced it wrong. He's the land use consultant and an expert on cocoa from Climate Focus. So I would like to invite you to discuss a little bit, and I think that Ruth has made a very interesting point on how the global landscape restoration movement has been moving forward, and there is political buy-in at the international level. We know that there is a lot of commitments, but there is still challenges for progress on the ground. And when trying to understand and capturing what are all those different conditions that enable progress on the ground, the Bonn Challenge, with the support of the government of Germany, has developed the Bonn Challenge Barometer of Progress. And what we have been able to see in the 5 jurisdictions, El Salvador being one of them, that has been piloting the barometer, we see that there is a lot of work on governance transformations, on working on technical capacities, on bringing stakeholders to the table from the sectors, but also from the private sector, to discuss what will help them to achieve these restoration efforts. And And in aggregate, these 5 jurisdictions have been able to date to restore the 40% of their targets under the bond challenge. So, Jorge, would you tell us a little bit about why restoration has been so important for the country and what have been the key success factors? And the same question goes for all of you. So, Jorge, would you like to start?
Okay, thank you. It's okay? I don't know. It's okay? I don't know. Okay, thank you. Thank you for inviting us to present the experience of El Salvador. I don't know if all know where is El Salvador is, but very important for us to explain what happened, what is the approach that we adopt to establish the National Ecosystem Restoration Program. I would like to start with thinking about the what happened for design to and implementation of our restoration program. We must consider 3 relevant issues or 3 relevant facts. The first one is El Salvador is located in Central America, and as you know, the IPCC has identified the Central America region as the tropical region most responsive to climate change. This is the first one. The second one is the El Salvador shows a high vulnerability to climate change due to a high level of the land degradation. And the third one is the last inventory of the greenhouse gases in El Salvador shows that follow-related activities are responsible for 58% of the emissions. With the three facts, we designed our program that the components I will support because my English I need to support with some slides no, it's okay. But in National Landscape and Ecosystem Restoration Program, we have 3 components that because the response to all the facts that I explained, that we need to adopt approaches. For example, a landscape approach. You need to adopt this issue. The synergy between mitigation and adaptation is not only focus for mitigation. It's not possible for us because we need to attend to address the problem that with climate change and include the adopt of the approaches that we call it for adaptation-based mitigation, because the adaptation is priority, but all the nature-based solution that we adopt is with 3, and we has a mitigation co-benefit too in all the actions. And the adaptation is priority, but the mitigation is the co-benefits. And we have the 3 components: the restore and conserve the critical ecosystem, restore the highly degraded lands with adopting the resilient agroforestry, for example, and establish the more synergic integration of physical and natural infrastructure. Because we have the problem with, for example, for flooding, but we need to respond immediately. No way to recover all the ecosystem service, because we need to time for this, and we for the response include physical infrastructure too for attendees. Oops. We adopt, with I say, the adopted landscape approaches that to build a resilient and adapt the strategy to adaptation to climate change. If you see the landscape for us is a mosaic of land use. For example, in our program, we attend the RED program. For us is all the references is protect the forest in the landscape and recover the forest ecosystem in the landscape to enhance carbon stocks. This is the RED program in the landscape, but the other is address the drivers of the deforestation or the land degradation, and we need to address the drivers simultaneously, and we protect the forest, and we attend the other, and we move to this to have a transition of the non-sustainable use or in the current use now and sustainable use. This transition is very important for us for attend all the landscape and move the landscape to resilient or landscape sustainable. Okay. How do you do this intervention in the underground? We identify a landscape in the country and prepare one plan in a inclusive manner. For example, this is the process that in the participatory manner we identify the vulnerabilities in the landscape, the restoration priority in the landscape, and all stakeholders, the relevant stakeholders, prepare the plan, identify the solution in base that the information that the Ministry of Environment prepare. For example, we apply the RAM, the IUCN for identified restoration priorities. We have this information. We have information about the vulnerabilities for the people that plan, that have identification these areas, and after we prioritize, do have a prioritization of the restoration techniques for attend or protect these areas, for forest areas, for example, and prepare the local restoration plans to address the and monitoring. Half a time, I don't know. And after we have a lines for implementation and have inclusive restoration too. This is the program that. The problem, in another country have problem because the not inclusive the indigenous people or local people. In this case, it's a private sector is here because it's attend to vulnerability that affected the activities, the production and productive activities too. Private sector, local communities, indigenous people all work in this idea. Okay. Yes, I don't know if for the moment.
Yeah. Thank you so much,
you.
Jorge, for all that information on the progress and and how you're operationalizing this landscape approach. And I would like to go now to Stephanie. Ecuador is a leader in RED. It's the one of the first countries to complete, or the first country to complete the Warsaw Framework for RED. It's the first country to get funding from the Green Climate Fund for implementation of the RED strategy. So tell us a little bit, where does restoration fit in all of these, and how does the country, what has been the success factor, which of so many success factors you have identified that has enabled the country to make so much progress?
Well, thank you for inviting us to speak here today. And I think that speaking to one sole factor is difficult, and I think that it would be insufficient. I think that there's many different elements that play into the fact that RED Plus has been, or the RED approach has been so successful in Ecuador, and I think that primarily because it's very complementary with our national framework, our legal framework. As some of you might know, Ecuador is the first country to acknowledge nature's rights as part of the rights that it guarantees within the Constitution. So for us, RED became not just a project or a policy, but rather a national, not just a project or a program, but rather a national policy. So I think that beginning with that would be one of the main factors for success. Then another element that's important to note is that given that it's become a policy that not only works with different sectors but also at different levels, we decided to work closely with a small group that we call the Red Table, and it's made up of 28 different stakeholders, including the private sector, academic representatives, as well as the indigenous peoples. And that's very important because they were an integral part of being able to develop this strategy and making it really fit the needs and the way that we are approaching conservation. So we developed everything from the main concepts around conservation together. We also developed the strategies. We've developed the safeguards, and making it really fit our national reality has been one of the main success factors as well. And just for us, being able to pioneer in these different initiatives has also helped us bring in other actors and bring attention to it through different decision makers in Ecuador. Thinking of the Ministry of Agriculture, for instance, being able to bring them in and have them be involved with the policy had a lot to do with also being able to get financing for it. It called attention to the initiative. It called attention to it becoming a national policy. And that's why we are continuously trying to bring in more funding and apply these different options that are available to our countries through the results that we've achieved.
Sorry. Thanks, Stephanie. That's so interesting. And now, that both of you have mentioned the role of stakeholders and working with other sectors, and I think that it's quite interesting to reflect on where exactly the private sector can fit in these strategies. We have been discussing worldwide for the last few years on how the private sector has a key role to play and how there needs to be public-private collaboration, but how can we operationalize it? This is a big question. And Climate Focus have been working with the World Cocoa Foundation and some of the companies part of the World Cocoa Foundation on precisely operationalizing their deforestation-free commitment. So Alan, tell us a little bit of what have you been working with them and how what have been the success factors of the World Cocoa Foundation on making so much progress?
Sure. So like Maria said, we work a lot on deforestation-free commitments across the big four commodities. But I've had the pleasure to work with on the Cocoa and Forest Initiative the past 2 years. And so within that, it seems the success has been essentially around alignment between you have companies, governments, farmers, and NGOs all at the same table. They're also aligned on their priorities. And so one of the successes of CFI so far has been able to agree on what are these priorities for both company action plans and for the national implementation plans on the side of the governments. And so what you have there is then the ability to scale because you have multiple national systems or national programs that are operating in parallel and have multiple synergies. In setting up CFI in Ghana, Ghana already had its Cocoa Forest Red program. It already had a 2 million hectare bone challenge commitment. And in doing so, it had the outputs from its restoration opportunities assessment, which included vast areas of opportunity for agroforestry and also wide-scale reforestation of the forest reserves within the Red program. And so within that, what we've been able to do is bring together World Cocoa Foundation as a leader for the trade as the trade association leader for all the cocoa companies. We have IDH, the Dutch Sustainable Trade Initiative, which is doing a lot of the government engagement. And we also have Prince Charles with ISU. Back when the CFI was first launched, he sort of led the movement to get the companies to actually all buy into this. And so what what you get from having all of these companies, which now I think we're up to 31 as of a couple of weeks ago, you basically captured pretty much the entire cocoa sector in West Africa, where all of the cocoa that's either bought, sold, traded, processed, manufactured is flowing through one or multiple deforestation-free commitments. And so in doing so, you have leverage and you have scale, both with the companies sort of competing with each other, and you also have the governments that are being communicated to by one voice of all the companies together. And so the companies, and similar to what Charlotte, my boss, was talking about this morning in our Goal 10 report, is that governance is key. And so what the companies have been able to communicate collectively is that we need safeguards, we need updated forest maps, we need legal recognition of remaining forest lands in Ghana, and you need just sort of compliance systems to keep everyone in check and to basically lift all boats. And then so what we've done for defining priorities is a very extensive consultation process from the bottom up and from the top down, from governments to bringing in individual farmers from all across the country, in Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, and Colombia has been also joined the CFI, but that's a separate process. You also already had, with the RED program, they defined hotspot intervention areas in Ghana's case. And so from there, you already have a prioritization system built into the cocoa forest landscape. And you already have companies that are sourcing from there, and they're implementing agroforestry, or at least they want to. And you have agreement from the governments that the forest reserves that are remaining in Ghana, that these are to be restored. And so what they've done is found a very synergistic way of combining the fact that the entire sector relies on the forest remaining and the forest being restored throughout the rural domain and the forest reserves throughout Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire's context as well. And so what you have there is an impetus to agree on business models that meet farmer needs for living income, meets production needs for the companies to produce more cocoa on less land, and also finding these synergies to, as far as bringing in the FLR activities of agroforestry, silvicultural methods, and regeneration, where in the forest reserves in Ghana, you have companies agreeing to partner with the governments and with the ministries and with the farmers to create this collaborative opportunity to plant cocoa, food crops, and timber trees, all in this systematic temporal scale where you eventually restore the forest as you keep the communities able to grow food as they move throughout the forest, and as they move throughout the forest, you're restoring it as you go. So it's met a lot of needs all at once through a bunch of actions that they've all aligned upon the past 2 years of many discussions. And so essentially what we've done since then is developed a framework for each country, a framework for action, which embodies these joint commitments and joint actions of companies and governments. And those frameworks have been used to develop national implementation plans, which are the government plans, and those are well aligned then with what we've done with all of the companies, where we developed one action plan template essentially, where every company now, so all 30 companies, including your large Barry Callebaut's to your tiny little Tom's Group, that buy 100,000 tons of cocoa and 1,000 tons of cocoa, they are all using the same action plan, and so you all have them contributing to agroforestry, to restoration in the rural domain of planting trees both on and off farm, and that has allowed us to basically set actions over the next 5 years as opposed to just 1 year at a time that these sustainability programs within cocoa companies had been operating. And so through alignment, we've been able to scale, and we've also been able to increase ambitions of the cocoa sector through private sector actions. And in doing so, we'll bring more accountability into the existing RED programs that these can be nested into, which can then be used to enhance NDCs. And so alignment and scale has been the major success factors there.
Thank you, Alan. This is great to hear, and I think that this is quite interesting because we, the global community working on climate change and on restoration, we always discuss about drivers of deforestation and making progress on RED readiness and designing RED strategies, or also designing forest landscape restoration strategies. But I guess you have given us in a nutshell a clear perspective on how bringing those different agendas together is feasible, including the private sector deforestation-free commitments. And I wonder, what are those technical capacities or those financial capacities that the countries or the World Cocoa Foundation in this case have had or have been able to bring to these processes that have enabled them in all of your cases to make so much progress? Because I guess if countries or the private sector on their own had those resources as a business as usual, probably would be in a better position in the land use sector, and clearly we would not be having such a significant contribution in terms of greenhouse gases to the climate system. So tell us a little bit about those financial or technical capacities that you have had or that still are needed. Jorge, do you want to start? Just for the time's sake, maybe 2 minutes.
Yeah. I have another. I don't know, is a move is possible? Yeah, no, it is, yeah. No, because it's two things is very important for understanding in numbers, no, in money, what happened with I say that what happened in the landscape. We made the economic and financial analysis for the different transition that have in we need to transition in the landscape or the other in the different land uses of in the mosaic, and we have to put this information of the all stakeholders to understand what is the possibility to increase the financial increase to the last one? Yeah. And for transition, we have a guide for technical guidelines to understand what happened with this transition. But for the capacity, I think that the better is to we need to progress measure, and we need to do the progress measure and the benefit measure too, to the all the stakeholders understand what happened in this process. But this is very, very important, very difficult for us, because all the RED program, all the tools that we have is focused on the carbon focus, because it's only for mitigation. What happens with the other benefit is very, very important for us for understand what happened. This is the progress that we have in the 1 million, the target 1 million for all the program. We have the 125,000 the advance. But I need to show what the next is very important for the stakeholders too. But this we need to capacity to design it, to roll it, to implement one indices for what happened with what is the move to is the landscape sustainability, and we need to the measure is the index. What you have, for example, biodiversity index. What do you have? What happened with water quality or soil index? We need to put many things in this for understand what happened in the progress and the recovery of ecosystem service in your landscape. But we need to establish or to design a new model that we don't have in the Thank
All right. Well, thank you, Jorge, for some of that information that you've given us. I think, kind of relates to also what we've encountered with our landscape approach. I think that it has allowed us to really see how the different stakeholders integrate into the problematic, and I think that's been one of the main success factors, to be able to see and to really focus on guaranteeing not only people's rights, because people that live in these areas, they have a right to develop, they have a right to produce, they have a right to maintain their livelihoods. And at the same time, nature has rights. So how do we integrate all these different elements into policy, and how do we really, as government actors, how do we implement measures and get financing in order to help them, maintain their livelihoods, and in the case of nature, to maintain its livelihood as well. So in that sense, for us, it's been about being able to really, first of all, have a baseline of information that allows us to monitor. Also, being able to work with with the local stakeholders, the people that are living in that area, which are mainly people who live from agriculture, and that's one of the main reasons or the main drivers of deforestation is agriculture and the expansion of the agricultural frontier, and being able to work with these actors in not only things like capacity building for sustainable production and helping them finance this production, but also integrating them into this approach, which is very new, and being able to bring attention to the fact that we are pioneering many of these initiatives and making that also one of the elements that brings a sense of identity to the local actors. I think that's been one of the important elements.
Great, thank you, Stephanie. And Alan, what have you seen in the private sector, or in the case of cocoa, in this case?
Yeah, so I just want to make a first point before that, just sort of going off of what you heard about our NYDF Goal 10 findings this year. Last year, we actually looked at finance as far as greening these commodity supply chains and getting finance to reducing deforestation. And we found that there was over $400 billion in capital stocks for private finance flows in ag, forests and fisheries and deforestation countries, whereas there was only $3 billion in sustainable commodity work. And so just the mismatch there sort of lends itself to understanding the scale of the problem here. But in cocoa, I think we have a pretty good opportunity to start leveraging multiple programs that are driving finance, that are also matching funds with private sector investments. And so what we're doing is working with all the individual companies and also collectively in Côte d'Ivoire, where they've just launched their forest investment program through the World Bank. And there, basically, we are working with, through the company action plans that we're also building with them. We're then aligning them with these existing World Bank finance flows so that we can take private sector financing for their productivity budgets, and then align it with what the World Bank and what the REDD programs want to accomplish in Côte d'Ivoire. And so we're bringing matching funds into agroforestry work, into reforestation, and to other climate-smart investments at the farm level. And so from there, you can basically increase spending from the companies and redirect their resources towards reforestation and agroforestry at the farm level and at their entire sourcing shed, essentially. And I thought it was interesting at the IDH 10-year anniversary event a couple months ago, where Sonny, the CEO of Olam, he talked about how basically companies that are not putting these investments up are thinking more short term in terms of thinking about their value of their stock as being what they need to look at, whereas the value of the company's stock is really only capturing their current value in the next few years. The vast majority of the value of a company is based on what your future earnings are going to be. And so what we're doing here with companies is making them understand that the long-term investments is actually what's going to safeguard their long-term production supply of cocoa. And so one of the other things we're doing is coordinating with the ministries, with the national governments, to basically show this is where companies are working. So we're basically doing intervention mapping of where Cocoa and Forest Initiative actions are happening from the private sector. And then resources, the financing from the extension services of national governments can then fill in the gaps in the other parts of the cocoa landscape so that resources are better spent. When it comes to technical support for cocoa, it's been really interesting now to use new climate suitability mapping for all of West Africa that shows where cocoa is going to be able to grow and where it's going to be most effective, whereas also where you need more systemic changes. And that allows for prioritization, again, of financial support and technical support to say, this is where there's going to be a systemic change. Therefore, you need to drastically increase your attention to this spot to either diversify farmers or take them into agroforestry to build more resilience in their farms, or transition them completely out of cocoa. And the same can be said, we work with cattle, with ranchers in Colombia, to basically get them to intensify their cattle onto a much smaller piece of land and then diversify their income streams through agroforestry, plantations, and reforestation. So basically but to do that, the technical support, both for the cocoa side and for the cattle side, you need not just to give them the best management practices, but they need to be able to understand what is the business model that they're going to be adopting and how it's going to work for them and how they can actually deploy it. And so when they deploy these technical mechanisms that allow them to keep their income flowing throughout the year and over the next several years. And then just a little bit on the monitoring aspect of this, which goes back to the alignment I was talking about earlier, is that you need quantitative, you need measurable, you need verifiable targets from the private sector in order to align them with restoration. And so that's why we built basically these FLR activities that are aligned with the CFI into the action plans of each individual company. So now each company has to commit to a certain number of hectares or a number of trees distributed into a defined landscape. And so that will drastically enhance the ability to monitor FLR outcomes per company and in defined landscapes that the government can then leverage into their NDCs.
Thank you. This has been also interesting, and I see a lot of people taking notes, including myself. So I think this is super informative, and I guess this discussion takes me back to some of the key elements that have been mentioned in the IPCC special report on the 1.5 degree world, which refers to all those implementation challenges that all of us are facing to transform our landscapes and the way in which we use or misuse the natural resources and forests and productive lands. So this brings me to my last question, and I would say that probably we have 2 minutes also for each one of you to respond, and it's that given all the progress that you have, but also given all the great efforts to bring different stakeholders, different actors from other sectors of the economy and other ministries to the table, the private sector, what do you think are the perspectives towards including all of these efforts or reflecting forest landscape restoration activities or landscape efforts in a more prominent and actionable way, measurable way in NDC's revision towards 2020? So, Jorge?
Yeah, for us, the National Restoration Program is key in the NDCs. We have 1 million hectares that they have the country of we need to restore, and we but very important for us is because we have NDC, but we have HE targets, we have LDN in the UNCCD, and for us it's very important this synergy. We attend all the targets that we need to stay. For example, in our program, we included the land degradation neutrality too for the tree index that gives a tree cover to productivity and the carbon in soil. If you see in the index, we have a carbon index too in there. For example, in Aichi target, we established the program with Aichi 15 with support the German cooperation, and for INDC it's very important to do in the synergy between adaptation and mitigation too.
For our NDC, I think that RED has been an important element as a national policy. I think that one of our main challenges now is that we are only able to, or we only have reference levels for deforestation. We haven't been able to map them out for the other activities, and I think that it has mainly to do with a lack of financing and national capacities as well. And we're working on building these up and getting additional financing for it. And I think that given that we do have as much attention as we do on a national level from the different sectorial authorities, we're having an integrated approach to it. However, for this first NDC that we're presenting, we're trying not to, be over ambitious. I think that's one of the main challenges as well, not being too ambitious. Because as much of an ally as forests are to greenhouse gas emissions reduction, it can also be, a great source of, if we are not able to meet with our goals, it can also be a great source of emissions. So being able to have the information that we need to monitor, being able to also bring in enough financing to create the incentives for the private sector and also for our public actors or stakeholders is important. So we really rely on being able to not only get people from the inside to get on board, but also being able to access these different funding opportunities available and keeping them replenished and open, which is also a very big challenge because it's really pivotal to the sustainability of these types of initiatives.
Yeah, so on NDCs, and Maria can tell you that I've read them all back to front to back. But basically IUCN and Climate Focus did an analysis of all the NDCs this year, and basically did an interpretation of FLR in NDCs. You can find it all on the infoflr.org website. But basically, we looked at differentiating FLR-aligned activities, so your planted forest, regeneration, agroforestry, silviculture, and so on, where those are found in NDCs, whether they're a target as part of an actual LULUCF contribution in the actual NDC target section, or whether they're basically we're deeming a non-target as it's part of an NDC narrative or supplementary information within an NDC. And so overall, we found an enormous amount of FLR-aligned activities in terms of hectares and tons in NDCs. We found 113 million hectares of FLR overall within NDCs. However, only 10 million hectares of that was adaptation. So we also broke it up by whether it was a mitigation or adaptation-based target, and whether it was conditional or unconditional, and whether it was mitigation or adaptation. So within the actual targets, we found 56 million hectares and 57 million hectares of non-targets. And then one of the other issues that we found within the NDCs is that even though we broke them up by activity per country and per conditionality and mitigation adaptation, you still had 41 million hectares of the overall 113 that were just labeled as other, because they just said restoration, or they just lumped a bunch of activities together without explaining of what level they were going to do of each of those things. So that's lumped in as other, just general restoration. One of the other things is that 60 million hectares of the 113 is all conditional, with it varying in terms of wanting international support or waiting for finance or Article 6 types of transactions. The other thing is basically there seems to be a bond challenge mismatch in the NDCs. While there is almost 170 million hectares of bond challenge commitments, when we put the numbers all side by side, we see that there's only 153 million hectares of the bond challenge that is not evident in NDCs. And so you don't have countries clearly communicating. It might be there in their tons or in their LULUCF contribution, but it's not talked about as either their bond challenge or as general restoration. And you also have 46 million hectares in NDCs that are in bond challenge countries but have not been, they don't match. Like the numbers aren't aligning between countries, their bond challenge and their NDCs. But what do we think one of the opportunities is that we've been exploring with IUCN is all of the deforestation-free commitments across commodities that rely on restoring landscapes to continue production going forward, is to leverage things like the cocoa industry, the coffee industry, the cattle, beef for agroforestry deployment, for silvopastoralism, other silvicultural enhancements. But what we find there is also the targets within NDCs for those activities could be greatly leveraged based on the area of land that we know is undergoing silvicultural enhancements or the area of agroforestry. A senior person at eCraft at an event the other day said there was about 1 billion hectares of agroforestry in the world if you define it as 10% tree cover on croplands. But we only find about 5 million hectares of agroforestry specifically mentioned in NDCs. And we know that across cocoa, coffee, and other forms of agricultural production that there is agroforestry there, but it's not being clearly communicated in NDCs. Same with silviculture. We know that there's a lot of managed forests in the world. Plus one third of the world's forests are managed forests. But we only have 10 million hectares of targets for silviculture, and 3 million hectares of that is conditional. And so working with the forestry industry to increase the actual actions on the ground for enhancing sustainable forest management is also missing, but an opportunity to enhance NDCs. And it also seems to be there's a deficit in the ability or willingness to measure the contribution of activities of FLR type activities from hectares into CO2, because the vast majority of targets that we found were in hectares, but not communicated in terms of their contribution in tons to be reduced or tons captured in the landscape. And then just overall, just wanted to talk about how because of the mismatch in the only the 10 million hectares of adaptation, that clearly, as we've talked about FLR a lot, that there's the mitigation component of that and there's the adaptation component, but it's the mitigation adaptation synergy is not clearly represented in NDCs, and I think that would greatly enhance the messaging overall of the type of synergies that countries are looking at for adaptation-based mitigation activities and vice versa.
Okay, thank you so much for this discussion. This has been great. And we are almost out of time, so I just want to quickly wrap up the key messages that I've captured throughout our discussion. And I guess I would like to start with a key message that restoration is broadly misunderstood or just categorized as afforestation and reforestation most of the times, but you have given us a lot of examples on how restoration could be done to mostly restore the ecological functionality of the landscapes, whether they are forest landscapes or other kind of ecosystems or degraded land or productive land, that you can restore the ecosystem services and the productivity and the resilience of different types of mosaic land uses. Another key message probably is what all of you have mentioned on how it is important to make sure that there is alignment and coherence across land use policies and objectives. And I guess this is at multiple levels. At one level is at bringing together international commitments to bring together those different agendas and align those international objectives and commitments that countries have, whether it's under the UNFCCC, the CBD, the Convention for Desertification, the Bond Challenge, that this is something that has been instrumental for some of the cases that you have been referring to in bringing those different agendas together and allocating the international support and the domestic funding that you have for those activities in a more efficient way. At a different level, aligning national policies, cross-sectoral policies, it's also key if you want to accelerate and scale up the pace of restoration of the landscape and achieving simultaneously different objectives: adaptation, mitigation, but also sustainable development, water security, food security, because of this different alignment of objectives. And another one is also going to the local level, bringing local stakeholders, farmers, local development offices to the discussion so that you can clearly bring all the key stakeholders to the discussion to negotiate those trade-offs on different land uses and how to maximize the synergies between mitigation and adaptation, but also reducing those risks of competition for the land. I think this is also something key that you have been mentioning, the importance of having strong economic analysis and working on those business models and in understanding what are the real costs for achieving these mitigation or adaptation strategies beside the market signal or besides the funding that has been flowing, I think that understanding, based on what you have been saying, understanding clearly how much is going to be how much is going to be the cost, the real cost of making these activities implementable is essential, not only for having the buy-in of other sectors, but also from the stakeholders on the ground. But also, if we want to increase the ambition in NDCs, because this is in order for these commitments to be actionable or realistic. Another key element that has been mentioned is the MRV barrier so far, how complicated it is still to monitor restoration on the ground, and how this is a limitation for science-based and actionable and measurable targets in NDCs. So probably this is a great message that we should be continue to discuss, and how we can overcome this challenge. And with that, I think our time is out. I want to thank all of you to be here. And if you have more questions for our panelists or for Ruth, please approach them after this session. And thank you so much.